he's made time and time again. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I'd suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate working on flood insurance legislation this afternoon. We have also heard senators making remarks about tonight's State of the Union address, which you can watch live on C-SPAN. Preview program gets underway at 8 Eastern. The speech itself starts at 9 Eastern. And again, you can see that on C-SPAN. While this quorum call continues, remarks now from one of the sponsors of the flood insurance bill, Senator Mary Landrieu. Here's what she had to say about the measure earlier today.
I'm going to speak then on the bill that's before us, and I really appreciate the cooperation of so many members last night that voted to move forward on the debate of the fix to Biggert Waters. We had a very strong, very impressive vote. I think 83 members, Republicans and Democrats, came together from all parts of the country, from all different areas and districts and backgrounds to vote to move forward on the debate on flood insurance. And I'm really grateful. We've been working on this for about a year and a half. It's been a tough slog because 2 years ago a bill called Biggert Waters was passed, named after their two co-sponsors in the House, Congresswoman Biggert and Congresswoman Waters, who passed a bill with very good intentions, thinking that they were going to strengthen the flood insurance program. The bill had wonderful intentions, but unfortunately, the way it was finally drafted in the conference committee, it's had disastrous results. And some of us knew that 2 years ago and started working literally the moment the conference bill was passed to begin changing it. And so we have worked diligently and together and built a great coalition.
Objection.
Mr. President, I grew up in East St. Louis, Illinois, on the banks of the Mississippi River. And as a child, it was a dominant feature in my life, crossing that river, watching that river. And it didn't take long as I grew up to realize that that river has a mind of its own. Last year, because of drought conditions in the Midwest, the Mississippi River was so low in January or February of 2013 that the Army Corps of Engineers had to come out on an emergency basis and scour literally the bottom of the river of rock formation so that navigation could continue. We were worried that we would have to shut down this major economic artery in the Midwest because the river was so low. The Army did a great job. Navigation continued with only slight delays and no major interruptions. Within 60 or 90 days, that same river was at flood stage. That is the kind of thing that those of us who grew up in the Midwest come to expect and understand, the unpredictability of that river. And as you grew up and started to look around you, you realized that there were bluffs behind you that at one point were the banks of this great river, and that we were living in the floodplain, if you will, that area close to the river that once was totally underwater, way back when. And so there were flooding episodes, as most communities went through, and efforts made to deal with that flooding, including the building of levees. And those levees, for the most part, on the Illinois side of the river, have been reliable. Some have questioned whether they can meet 500-year standards or these epical floods, and I think that question's well worth asking. But the fact is that the efforts made on the Illinois side, I can't speak for others, at least in that region, have really been up to the task, and we've not had serious flooding in a long, long time in that part of the world. But because of concerns raised by the Army Corps of Engineers about whether these levees that protect the towns and businesses and families were up to the job, something really remarkable occurred. We had people who lived in the counties, and I'll be more specific in just a moment, in the counties closest to that area. The leaders got together and said, we're not going to wait on the federal government. We are going to impose a tax on ourselves and raise tens of millions of dollars to start fortifying these levees to protect our towns and businesses. I don't know if that's ever happened anywhere else, but you really have to salute them. They weren't waiting for Uncle Sam to show up and ride to the rescue. They took it in their own hands. Well, I salute them because they did raise the money, and they're prepared, and they are fortifying those levees. I love the Army Corps of Engineers. They came to our rescue last year. But the locals have said, Army Corps, would you come in and certify these levees, that they're stronger now than they ever were? And they've been slow to do it. It's frustrating. The locals are doing everything you could ask of them, and they aren't getting at least a timely response from the Army Corps of Engineers. And so as a consequence, we're living in this uncertain world. All of these businesses, all of these towns, all of these families in this so-called floodplain believe they're protected by the levees. Levees have not been certified by the Corps, and now comes the new National Flood Insurance Program and says to the people living there, you're going to have to pay higher premiums for flood protection in the future. And they rightly say, wait a minute, we are paying higher sales taxes. We voted to pay higher sales taxes to protect ourselves, and now you're saying we still have to pay higher premiums. Well, that really gets to the heart of why we're on the floor discussing the National Flood Insurance Program. And I'd like to say a few words about my position on it, because it's one that I've struggled with, to try to find the right answer in light of what I think is an extraordinary, if not heroic, effort by local people to address their problem, not to wait for the federal government, their frustration not having at least a timely cooperation by the Army Corps of Engineers, and now the prospect that the premiums for their flood insurance are going to go up despite their best efforts to protect themselves. If they were doing nothing, Mr. President, standing back and saying, this isn't our worry, if something bad happens, Washington will ride to the rescue, that's one thing. But they are doing something specific that costs them money, that they're trying to protect themselves. Rapid increases in flood insurance premiums, which are on the horizon, are hard for many people in my state. For the people in Metro East, which is the area I've just described, which is on the eastern side of the Mississippi River across from St. Louis, the southwestern part of Illinois, for many of them, this increase in these premiums would be impossible for them to pay. 40% of the Metro East that I've just described is mapped as floodplain, and most of the National Flood Insurance Program policyholders there have their premiums subsidized. This meant that instead of paying $500 a year, they were paying about $150, made it more affordable to them. However, the new increases that are anticipated could be as much as 400%. Granite City, Illinois, policyholders paid $585 last year for flood insurance. But with the new increases, the premiums are expected to rise to $1,500 or even $2,000 a year. Now, for some people, $2,000 a year may not sound like a sacrifice. But, you know, hardworking families in small homes that they've worked hard to buy and build, another $2,000 a year can make some real impact on their life. Additionally, 30,000 new structures in Metro East could be newly mapped into a floodplain when FEMA finally finalizes its flood maps. These homeowners could end up paying $500 to $2,000 a year for flood insurance. Allowing their premiums to rise so high so quickly is just unacceptable, especially given how the people in Metro East have worked together over the last 7 years at significant expense to themselves to improve the 74-mile levee system. In 2007, the Army Corps notified Metro East locals that their levees needed improvement. The next year, FEMA notified them that much of the area would be mapped into a floodplain, triggering mandatory flood insurance purchase requirements unless the levee was improved. Now, in response to it, the three Metro East counties I mentioned earlier, Madison, Monroe, St. Clair, where I grew up, taxed themselves to pay for the improvements to their levees. They've raised $150 million, Mr. President, and I believe that this type of local commitment is unprecedented. I don't know that anyone else is doing this. They did it. There have been a number of setbacks, but when they occur, I've tried to work with the Army Corps, with my colleagues in Congress, to get these projects back on track. I commend the people in Metro East for working together to honestly address the threat of flooding. No community wants to go through the pain and loss of damaging flooding. You've been through it, West Virginia, Mr. President. I've been through it. 20 years ago, 1993, there was a horrific flooding on the Mississippi River, and there have been several instances since. I was out there piling up the sandbags with a lot of folks trying to protect homes and businesses. But these communities in Metro East are actively doing something to prevent the recurrence of that kind of a disaster. So while the locals continue to work with the Army Corps to achieve the highest level of levee protection as quickly as possible, I want to continue to make their work a priority in my efforts. Because the residents of Metro East have taken on a significant financial commitment to protect homes and businesses, I'll work to ensure their flood insurance premiums are affordable. I want to draw attention to the way the residents of Metro East have taken the initiative to help protect themselves from the risk of flooding, because not every community has engaged as directly with this threat as they have. My constituents in this part of the country, for the most part, cannot afford to buy flood insurance at the new levels and the new rates. I agree with the effort underway by Senators Menendez, Isaacson, Landrieu, and others to slow down these increases, and that's why I'm supporting their effort. But we need to do this with our eyes wide open. The National Flood Insurance Program is not going to keep up with the cost of recovery from severe weather events that we see on the horizon. The National Flood Insurance Program provides nearly 6 million business owners, homeowners, and renters $1.2 trillion in coverage. The problem is the program simply doesn't collect enough money to cover the costs of rebuilding communities from floods, hurricanes, and other disasters. The flood insurance program will be more than $20 billion in debt after making payments for Superstorm Sandy. And if we in Congress continue to ignore the structural weakness in the flood insurance program, that deficit, that debt, that shortfall is just going to grow in the future. We can and should sadly expect more intense extreme weather events. According to computer models, the changing climate means that the storms we're seeing will become stronger and more extreme in the future, causing even greater amounts of damage. Nationwide, the financial consequences of weather-related disasters and climate change hit a historic high in 2012, causing over $55 billion in damages. Now, I had a hearing on this, Mr. President, and I thought, you know, if I bring in environmentalists, a lot of folks will discount it completely when they start talking about climate change. They may not attend. They may walk out of the room. So instead, I brought in people from the property and casualty industry, the insurance industry. What do they do for a living? They watch the weather. They watch it more closely than any politician ever did. And they decide adequate reserves to cover the premiums, adequate premiums to cover the reserves needed to protect from these weather disasters. The story they told us was get ready. The weather's going to get more extreme, and the cost and damages are going to grow dramatically. Some insurance companies, major insurance companies, have walked away from states saying there's just too much exposure there. We cannot charge premiums and collect enough to create a reserve in the instance of a natural disaster. Now, that's the reality of the private sector analysis of this. This isn't some pejorative term, tree-hugging environmentalists musing about possibilities. These are hard-hearted actuaries and accountants taking a hard look at what the future holds. The private insurance industry has looked at the scientific data, and they've made changes in the way they do business. They're adjusting their operations to prepare for worse weather and bigger losses. They've begun raising premiums for wind, earthquake, and flood insurance in areas where disasters are likely, ensuring the rates accurately reflect the risk of damage. The industry has also begun to refuse insuring properties and state that they're just too much risk. In contrast, the federal government has not adequately prepared to handle the growing number of severe weather events. Well, Senator Durbin, where does this leave you? You don't think your people can afford to pay their higher premiums, and yet you don't think the reserves set aside for the flood insurance program are adequate. I think that's the reality of what this political vote is likely to show. Yesterday, the vote on the floor was an overwhelming bipartisan vote to go forward on this measure. So we know the flood insurance program won't be able to keep up with the damage inflicted on our communities. The cost, asking homeowners and businesses to pay dramatically more in flood insurance premiums, is too high to make the National Flood Insurance Program viable in the near future. We need to recognize that losses from future floods will likely cost more than the National Flood Insurance Program can cover. And then, and that's where I think we need a dose of reality in this chamber and on Capitol Hill, Congress has to step up. That is a reality. We know these disasters are likely to occur, and we cannot, will not collect the premiums necessary to create the reserves to cover them. It will be our responsibility to ensure that help is there. whether that disaster is in Kansas, Illinois, West Virginia, or anywhere across the United States. Congress can't deny that help. It's time that we seriously address the effects of climate change and rethink how we protect and provide disaster assistance to communities on a regular basis. Those who choose to ignore the overwhelming scientific evidence of climate change cannot ignore the overwhelming accounting evidence that the National Flood Insurance Program will not be able to meet the increasing expense of natural flooding disasters. Our votes, if we pass this measure before us, may spare families from an unacceptable financial burden if flood premiums skyrocket, but they do not spare us from the reality that the damages from future flooding disasters will be nationalized as the damages of Katrina and Sandy were. Those who vote for this Menendez, Isaacson, Landrieu measure, as I will, are voting at the same time to nationalize the cost and damages of future disasters, to say that this is going to be something we will respond to as needed. I've done that throughout my congressional career in the House and Senate, stood up to help those regions of the country in trouble, from California all the way to the East Coast, and I'll do it again, because I think it is an American family responsibility. So there's a limitation to what this National Flood Insurance Program can achieve. There is certainly a limit to how much working families can pay for these premiums, and we have to accept the reality. When these flooding events occur, when these disasters occur, we have to accept that responsibility. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senior Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I rise today to discuss the Agriculture Act of 2014. That's the new name of the Farm Bill. After over 3 years of hard work by the House and Senate Agriculture Committees and other interested members, we are finally nearing the finish line for this version of the nation's farm and food policy. As all Kansans and all farmers and ranchers from every state know, the Farm Bill impacts not only our farmers and ranchers but also businesses up and down Main Street, as well as families in our rural towns and urban cities. Everyone in Kansas, people that work in agriculture or are impacted by its success, which, by the way, is every single American, and my colleagues in the Congress, deserve to know why I was the only senator on the conference committee not to sign the conference report as of last night. So I'm here today to fully explain my reasoning and why I cannot and will not vote for this legislation. It all comes down to this simple question. Does the new Farm Bill improve agriculture in America? I believe the answer is unfortunately no. While we all want to provide long overdue certainty to producers, something lacking for over 400 days, over 2 years, a record, the conference missed an opportunity for greater and necessary reforms to our nation's farm programs, federal nutrition programs, and burdensome regulations. We should not march backwards and pass a farm bill with more government subsidies, more regulations, and more waste. How on earth did we get to this point today? Back in 2011, Chairperson Stabenow and I started the process of writing a new farm bill with a field hearing in her home state of Michigan. Later that year, we held another successful hearing in Wichita, Kansas. After more formal hearings in the Senate and conversations with Kansas producers, Michigan producers, producers all over this country, it was clear to me that this farm bill would have to be reform-oriented, reduce the deficit, and be responsible, not only to farmers and ranchers, but also consumers and taxpayers. Unfortunately, as I stand here today, this farm bill does not meet those standards, and taken as a whole, the conference report fails to move both federal farm and food programs forward. Now, I previously voted against the Senate bill, which looked too much in the rearview mirror for outdated programs, but this report is even worse. Just listen to this. Last year's House bill was officially called the Federal Agriculture Reform and Risk Management Act. Reform, risk management. And here in the Senate, we passed the Agriculture Reform, Food and Jobs Act. The final report now is just reduced to the Agriculture Act, the Farm Bill. So today I'll focus my comments to three biggest concerns: the commodity subsidy programs, nutrition program spending, and the lack of regulatory reform, so sorely needed. Considering we all commonly refer to the legislation as the Farm Bill, my first concern and criticism is the new Price Loss Coverage, acronym for that, PLC, and it's a subsidy program. Back in 2012, 2 years ago, I was pleased that the Senate Agriculture Committee and the full Senate passed a bipartisan commodity title that contained real reform. We ended the current counter-cyclical commodity subsidy program, got the government out of the business of sending signals to producers, essentially telling them which crops to plant by setting target price guarantees for producers, farming for the government, not farming for the market. Unfortunately, that reform was replaced in the latest Senate bill with a new target price subsidy program and doubled down in the House version with even higher target prices and manipulated even more in the conference report to suit the desire of specific crops over the objections of others in different regions. The new price loss coverage program repeats a classic government subsidy mistake, setting high fixed target prices or subsidies, which only guarantees overproduction with long periods of low crop prices, leading to more expensive farm programs funded directly by taxpayers. Why do we have to go down that road again? I have yet to hear one legitimate explanation for why Congress is about to tell all producers across this country that the federal government will guarantee the price of your wheat at $5.50. By the way, it's a little over $6 right now at the country elevator in Dodge City, $5.50 per bushel, and rice at $14 per hundredweight for the next 5 years, regardless of what happens in the market. We have done this before, and we know that it creates planning and marketing distortions instead of letting our producers respond to market conditions. After the World Trade Organization, the WTO, ruled against the United States for our cotton programs, I thought we had learned a lesson. I have said it before and will say it again. The WTO stove is hot. Don't touch it. Why would we reach out and touch it again? Remember that we're still required to pay Brazil millions of dollars a year under that decision. The amber box subsidy programs in this bill will open agriculture to global trade disputes, which we have already lost and will likely lose again if challenged. And to date, objections, solutions from me, my colleagues ranging from South Dakota, Senator Thune, Nebraska, Senator Johans, Iowa, Senator Grassley, and even Ohio Representative Bob Gibbs have all fallen on deaf and stubborn ears. Our efforts to add market orientation to the price loss coverage subsidy program, as well as attempts to end it outright, have all been blocked and are certainly not reflected in the final report. I am equally unhappy with the final outcome of the nutrition title of this Farm Bill. Partisan politics has unnecessarily infiltrated this debate, with many members on the other side of the aisle drawing a line in the sand at zero savings or real reform to the expensive and unrestricted Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That's called stamps. It's really the food stamp program. Now, facts are stubborn things. Despite good intention, SNAP, food stamps, now make up more than 80% of the Department of Agriculture's budget and was previously exempted from across-the-board sequestration cuts. What we have here today is a ballooning and expensive set of federal nutrition programs with a patchwork of eligibility standards, loopholes, and frankly unneeded bonus to state governments for simply administering the program. You administer the program right, you get a bonus. I understand and sympathize with the need for nutrition assistance for hardworking families. I've been there. I have championed their efforts. However, we cannot and simply should not box off SNAP from necessary and timely reforms. While the Senate version of the bill in 2012 and 2013 did tighten the low-income heating and assistance program, the LIHEAP loophole, to save roughly $4 billion over 10 years, there have always been additional needed reforms to the program. At the end of the 2012 Senate bill, I included my personal views in the report. I identified 8 additional ways to rein in the out-of-control spending and reinstitute the program integrity for the SNAP program. Last year, in 2013, I introduced a standalone piece of legislation that would have saved a total of $36 billion in SNAP, a modest sum, without ever touching individual monthly benefits. And it failed on a party line vote. Now, eventually, the House of Representatives passed nearly $40 billion in savings after intense debate over there within the SNAP program. That's a 5% reduction over a 10-year period. Now, I don't see how the final legislation amounting to a 1% reduction in SNAP spending is a fair compromise between both versions of the legislation. This just does not add up. Now, in every single one of my town hall meetings in Kansas, and I know the acting presiding officer from West Virginia finds the same thing true in his home state. First question that fed-up producers and business owners ask is, how can we stop or even slow down the onslaught of regulations? This farm bill had great potential to help producers and ranchers and all of agriculture with reducing the crushing regulatory burden from the government's rules and requirements. They just want relief. Despite years of work in both committees and strong provisions in the House-passed farm bill, the final legislation lacks key common sense and sound science regulatory reforms. I am more than disappointed that a WTO-compliant resolution to something called the mandatory country of origin labeling, it's called COOL, was not reached. As a result, our livestock producers were already facing drought and high feed prices, but now they're going to have to worry about retaliatory actions by the governments of Canada and Mexico. Our ranchers are equally troubled at provisions in the House bill directing the USDA to refocus their efforts on the Grain Inspection Packers and Stockyards Act. The acronym for that is GIPSA. They were excluded. Another regulatory relief provision was already cleared by the full House and the Senate Ag Committee. It would have ended the duplicative National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. I won't try the acronym for that. These are pesticide permits required by the Environmental Protection Agency. We had an opportunity to protect human health and eliminate duplicative, unnecessary regulatory actions, and instead, despite hollow commitments to work together to resolve the issue, we were all blocked from including the simple and necessary regulatory relief. Each of these regulatory reforms had bipartisan support. But now producers across the country are left without an explanation and, much worse, no needed relief. I am shocked at how far some members will go to protect this administration's regulatory agenda instead of protecting real, hard-working Americans. After all of that, let me point out that with any large piece of legislation, one can usually find some positives to point to, and today's Farm Bill is no different. While I support many of the programs and the less talked about titles of the Farm Bill, I am especially appreciative of the inclusion of strong crop insurance provisions and livestock disaster programs. Our producers across the country, number one issue that we heard over and over and over again, and in every corner of Kansas, have said that crop insurance was their number one priority for the Farm Bill. Well, secondly, they said get the regulations off of our necks. The policies in the final bill protect the commitment to producers by strengthening crop insurance as the cornerstone of our farm safety net, regardless of the size of their farm or the commodity that they grow. And as this bill moves forward, the Risk Management Agency, RMA, will be busy offering expanded coverage for commodities like cotton that have not traditionally participated in the program as much as other crops. However, I am concerned that the conservation compliance requirements included in the legislation on crop insurance not on cropping operations, not on being a farmer, but on crop insurance, will unnecessarily burden producers who are already good stewards of their land and already subjected to conservation requirements in the commodity programs. This is a duplication, more paperwork. As the western half of Kansas continues to linger in a historic drought, the lack of livestock disaster programs that expired in 2011 is truly upsetting. Well, we should have never let the programs expire in the first place. We had an opportunity in 2012 to reauthorize them, but the Senate failed to act over my calls of action. All of the livestock disaster programs are finally retroactively authorized, but the assistance will be too little and too late in many parts of cattle country. Some have had to go ahead and, well, they just lost part of their herds and even strains of cattle. Unfortunately, as a Kansan, as well as a member of the Senate Agriculture Committee and the Farm Bill Conference Committee, I'm disappointed to say that the final policies of this Farm Bill do not outweigh the positives. While we all want to provide certainty to producers, the conference has missed an opportunity for greater and necessary reforms to our nation's farm programs, federal nutrition programs, and burdensome regulations. After over 3 years of debate, the challenges that agriculture faces at home and across the world have only continued to grow. We need 21st century policies and innovative solutions. Instead, this bill misses the mark and goes backwards to protectionist programs. Now, the issues I raised today deserve to be debated fully and publicly, and I'm going to do that later in later remarks before the Senate. I know time is of the essence here. Yet the full conference committee met only once for opening statements at last October. With all the ramifications of the Farm Bill, we met once last October, 3 minutes apiece. In truth, the majority of this bill was negotiated behind closed doors without the opportunity for votes, amendments, or discussion. Too much of that around here. Producers, consumers, and our global trading partners expected more. Unfortunately, the U.S. taxpayers deserve better than this conference report. I did not sign this conference report last night and cannot, in good conscience, vote for this legislation. But I will promise this to all the members that have worked so hard to at least get a bill. I will continue to work and advocate on behalf of advancing agriculture. Mr. President, I yield back.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Majority Leader.
Ask unanimous consent the call of the court be terminated.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to pre-morning business. Senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to calendar number 230, S1302, that the committee reported substitute be considered the Harkin-Roberts substitute amendment, which is it that has to be agreed to. The committee reported substitute is amended, be agreed to. Bill is amended, be read a third time and passed. And the motion reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate. Further, that if the Senate receives a bill from the House that is identical to the text of S1302 as passed by the Senate, then the House bill be read 3 times passed, and there be no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I now ask unanimous consent the Help Committee be discharged from further consideration of S334.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 334, recognizing the goals of Catholic School Week and honoring the valuable contributions of Catholic schools in the United States.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the committee is discharged.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution.
Senate will proceed to the measure.
The preamble be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be laid on the table, and there be no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I now ask unanimous consent the presiding officer of the Senate be authorized to appoint a committee on the part of the Senate to join a like committee on the part of the House to escort President Obama to the House chamber for the joint session to be held tonight at 9 p.m.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate recess until 8:25 today. Upon reconvening, proceed as a body to the Hall of the House of Representatives for the joint session of Congress provided under the provisions of H. Con. Res. 75. That upon the dissolution of the joint session, the Senate adjourn until 10 a.m. on Wednesday, January 29th, that following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired. General proceedings be approved today. The time for the 2 leaders be reserved for use later in the day. Following any leader remarks, the Senate be in a period of morning business for an hour with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each. And the time equally divided and controlled between the 2 leaders or designees, with the majority controlling the first half, Republicans the final half. The following morning business, Senate resumed consideration of the motion to proceed to S-1926 flood insurance legislation post-cloture, with the time until noon equally divided and controlled between 2 leaders or the designees, and at noon all post-cloture time be expired.
Without objection.
President Obama will deliver the State of the Union address at 9 p.m. tonight. The Senate will begin gathering in the Senate chamber at 8:20 and depart from the Senate chamber at 8:30 to proceed as a body to the House. Mr. President, if there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it recess under the previous order.
The Senate stands in recess until 8:25 this evening.
The Senate today continued work on legislation to delay planned increases in flood insurance rates.